High fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy fiction, defined either by its setting in an imaginary world or by the epic stature of its characters, themes and plot. Examples of high fantasy include The Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, Malazan Book of the Fallen, and The Wheel of Time have both of these attributes. High fantasy exists on one side of a spectrum, opposite low fantasy or urban fantasy, which are set in more realistic worlds. Some works, such as the Chronicles of Narnia, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, The Mortal Instruments, and the Neverending Story, concern characters that travel between realistic and imaginary settings, and are thus difficult to classify on this spectrum. High fantasy is often classified as epic fantasy. Although the two subgenres are extremely similar, the latter usually contains a wider range of main characters. Genre overview: high fantasy is defined as fantasy fiction set in an alternative, entirely fictional world, rather than the real, or primary world. The secondary world is usually internally consistent, but its rules differ in some way, from those of the primary world. By contrast, low fantasy is characterized by being set in the primary, or real world, or a rational and familiar fictional world, with the inclusion of magical elements. Nikki Gamble distinguishes three subtypes of high fantasy: a setting in which the primary world does not exist, the secondary parallel world, is entered through a portal from the primary world, a distinct world within a world is part of the primary world, where the primary world does not exist, detailed maps, geography, and history of the fictional world are often provided. The secondary world often is based on, or symbolically represents, the primary world. The Oxford of Philip Pullman's Northern Lights is similar, a world that is, both familiar and strange. Pullman's preface to that book explains that the setting is a universe like ours, but different in many ways. In the case of a world within a world, also known as a wainscot, the secondary world coexists with the primary world. However, the mundane inhabitants of the primary world are unaware of the secondary world. Gamble suggests that The Lord of the Rings takes place in a setting where the primary world does not exist. This was something Tolkien often denied. Rather, he suggested that Middle-earth was the primary world, but in the past. This was not always clear, however, as a few of his early letters describe that while his stories take place on Earth, elements of the stories is a kind of secondary or sub-creational reality, or secondary belief in replies to letters, or at a different stage of imagination. In most cases he is adamant that the events occurred on primary Earth, and not another planet. Setting: these stories are often serious in tone and epic in scope, dealing with themes of grand struggle against supernatural, evil forces. Some typical characteristics of high fantasy include fantastical elements such as elves, fairies, dwarves, dragons, demons, magic or sorcery, wizards or magicians, constructed languages, quests, coming-of-age themes, and multi-volume narratives. In some fiction, a contemporary, real-world character is placed in the invented world, sometimes through framing devices such as portals to other worlds or even subconscious travels. Purists might not consider this to be true high fantasy, although such stories are often categorized as high fantasy because they've yet to be classified as their own distinct subgenre, and often resemble this subgenre more closely than any other. High fantasy worlds may be more or less closely based on real-world milieu, or on legends such as the Arthurian cycle. When the resemblance is strong, particularly when real-world history is used, high fantasy shades into alternative history. The high fantasy genre's fandom ranges from Tolkien to contemporary. Recent screen versions of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit as well as Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader have contributed to the subgenre's continuing popularity. Moreover, film adaptations of some novels are in pre-production, such as David Farland's The Runelords, and also Terry Brooks' Magic Kingdom of Landover as well as The Elfstones of Shannara. Characters: many high fantasy storylines are told from the viewpoint of one main hero. Often, much of the plot revolves around his or her heritage or mysterious nature. In many novels the hero is an orphan or unusual sibling, often with an extraordinary talent for magic or combat. He or she begins the story young, if not as an actual child. In other works he is a completely developed individual with his own character and spirit. High fantasy is not limited to a male protagonist. The hero often begins as a childlike figure, but matures rapidly, experiencing a huge gain in fighting problem-solving abilities along the way. The plot of the story often depicts the hero's fight against the evil forces as a Bildungsroman. In many books there is a knowing, mystical mentor-teacher. This character is often a formidable wizard or warrior, who provides the main character with advice and help. In some books, there is also a mysterious Dark Lord, often obsessed with taking over the world and killing the main hero. This character is an evil wizard or sorcerer, or sometimes a kind of god or demon. This character commands a huge army and a group of highly feared servants. In some works the villain may have had a predecessoress who might have been superior or inferior to them. The progress of the story leads to the character learning the nature of the unknown forces against him, that they constitute a force with great power and malevolence. Good versus evil. Good versus evil is a common concept in high fantasy, and the character of evil is often an important concept in a work of high fantasy, as in The Lord of the Rings. Indeed, the importance of the concepts of good and evil can be regarded as the distinguishing mark between high fantasy and sword and sorcery. In many works of high fantasy, this conflict marks a deep concern with moral issues. In other works, the conflict is a power struggle, with, for instance, wizards behaving irresponsibly whether they are good or evil. In some works, as in large parts of Jordan's The Wheel of Time, the struggle between good and evil is mainly used as a backdrop for more intricate conflicts of interest, such as conflicts between different factions formerly on the same side in the good versus evil conflict. Recent fantasy novels have begun to depart from the more common good versus evil background that became prevalent after Lord of the Rings. Prominently, George R. R. Martin's acclaimed A Song of Ice and Fire series more or less abandons the good-evil paradigm in favor of a more politically based and multifaceted struggle between different ruling families, most of whom display both good and evil tendencies in pursuit of power, which takes the place of the main catalyst of the story. Although several characters who have a civilized, trustworthy guise do perform terrible acts of cruelty marking them as morally degenerate, their intentions are not necessarily evil. Often the villain will try to convince the hero either A, the villain is not in fact evil like the hero thinks he is, B, the hero is actually the evil immoral one, C, the mentor character has been using the hero's special qualities for his own ends and does not really care about him/her. Most of these arguments will be followed up by a conversion attempt, with promises of redemption for supposed misdeeds or glory, riches and power. Saga or series. From Tolkien to the modern day, authors in this genre tend to create their own worlds where they set multi-tiered narratives such as Shannara, Belgariad, Malloreon, Wheel of Time, Malazan Book of the Fallen, The Inheritance Cycle, The Black Company, The Sword of Truth, and Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Role-playing campaign settings like Greyhawk by Gary Gygax, Dragonlance by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weir and Forgotten Realms by Ed Greenwood are a common basis for many fantasy books, and many other authors continue to contribute to the settings. See also: Heroic Fantasy, Sword and Sorcery. Eric Ra 1/4 Cker Edison was a pre-Tolkien high fantasy writer. List of high fantasy fiction, list of high fantasy films and TV series, low fantasy, medieval fantasy, historical fantasy, list of genres, references.